Yeah. Okay. Good evening and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's KADIT seminar. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to briefly introduce KADIT. KADIT, the School of Comparative History of Religions, is an Istanbul-based independent and voluntary academic research group. We organized online seminars, lectures, and conferences in the field of history of religions and also related disciplines. Our aim is to support comparative, interdisciplinary, and scholarly discussions on religious traditions. The current research period of KADIT focuses on Gnosticism, and this is our fourth semester now. Today's lecture is part of this program also. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Reverend Dr. Mike Bird. Dr. Bird is Deputy Principal, Academic and Lecturer in Theology at Ridley College in Melbourne, Australia. His work brings together New Testament studies and systematic theology with special interest in early Christology, the Gospel of Mark, the Pauline epistles, 2nd century Christianity, and religious freedom. He's the author of more than 30 books, including Evangelical Theology, the Gospel of the Lord, and together with N.T. Wright, the New Testament in its World. Today, Dr. Bird will speak to us on the origins of Gnosticism, Jewish, Greek, Persian, or Christian. We are very grateful for his presence and contribution. Please join me in warmly welcoming Reverend Dr. Mike Bird. Yeah, Dr. Bird.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic to be with you from friends all over the US, Germany, Turkey, and of course, here in Australia. My natural background is more in New Testament studies, but if you want to understand the New Testament, you really have to grasp both its origins and its reception in the 2nd century. And in 2nd century Christianity, you've got to deal with a variety of phenomena, not least is the existence of groups who came to be known as Gnostics. I should add too, I'm aware that I have a distinct accent as a English speaker, as an Australian, so if at any point I need to slow down, feel free to just give me a bell and let me know. But back to our topic, the origins of Gnosticism are quite perplexing. We don't actually know for certain where it came from. And in debates these days, who actually qualifies as a Gnostic is also a contested claim. And generally, it's thought that there are certainly Gnostic groups in the 2nd century, but what counts as Gnosticism gets redefined or changed all the time. Certainly in the circles I move in, all sorts of things can be called Gnostic, anything that's anti-materialistic, anything that's dualistic. And this is kind of the danger, that Gnosticism can be treated so broadly as to be practically meaningless. And some people have argued the same thing is true in the 2nd century. So 2 influential scholars have argued that the category of Gnosticism is something of a scholarly fiction, a distorting lens inherited from the ancient heresiologists. So Michael Williams, writing in his 1996 book, Rethinking Gnosticism, argued that we should dismantle the category altogether and instead speak of a broad tradition of what he calls biblical demiurgism. Now, the demiurge is like a mediating figure who brings in to creation. Similarly, Karen King, in her book, What is Gnosticism?, contended that the label Gnostic was a form of deviant labeling, a polemical tool used by proto-Orthodox Christians like Irenaeus and Tertullian and Epiphanius and others to legitimize forms of Christianity that they disliked. Now, those are serious arguments, not without some merit. We should take them seriously, but we should also weigh them carefully. And in the end, I don't actually find the protests of Williams and King's convincing. If we follow Williams, we find that biblical demiurgism is so broad as a category to be meaningless. After all, Jews, Platonists, Paul, John, Marcionites, Valentinians all believed that God created through some intermediary figure. So the Gnostics, or biblical demiurgists, pretty much includes everyone. I mean, Paul, John, Philo, Plutarch, everyone's a type of demiurgist in a sense. So it's kind of a meaningless category. You can understand what it's trying to correct, but the alternative is not actually all that better. As for King's concern that it's simply a form of deviant labeling, well, again, it's true that Christian heresiologists were biased and certainly not lacking any polemics in what they said about different and dissident Christian groups. But we do know there were groups who called themselves Gnostics. Origen against Celsus has Celsus stating exactly that there was a group called Gnostics in contrast to the great church. And even Plotinus, in his work against Gnostics, attacks a group whose beliefs correspond strikingly with what Irenaeus describes. And crucially, when Irenaeus describes Gnostic groups and Gnostic beliefs, those descriptions can be mapped with considerable precision onto documents like the Apocryphon of John. And I think the Apocryphon of John is probably ground zero when we're looking at a Gnostic text. So we are, I think, dealing with a real phenomenon, a diverse, contested, and difficult to find, but nonetheless real. And as Carl Sean O'Brien neatly summarizes, Gnosticism remains a convenient label to present an anti-cosmic tradition in which the Platonic demiurge undergoes a radical transformation and in which the separation between the first principle and the demiurgic one appears to reach its most extreme. With that understanding of Gnosticism in place, let us turn to the question of its origins. To ask where Gnosticism came from is to confront an immediate methodological problem. We're trying to trace the genealogy of a movement whose documents are often undatable, whose geographical provenance is uncertain, and whose relationship to other religious currents of antiquity is deeply ambiguous. The ancient heresiologists, though, had an answer. For Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, and others, Gnosticism was a Christian heresy traceable back to a single diabolical source, Simon Magus, the Samaritan magician who appears in the book of Acts, chapter 8, offering money for the apostolic gift of the Spirit. A whole mythology surrounds Simon, and in the telling of heresiologists, Simon becomes a kind of arch-heretic, the patient zero of the Gnostic infection. This is a rhetorically satisfying account, but it's historically almost certainly a fiction or a retrojection. The heresiologists always wanted to map heresies in terms of a genealogy, kind of like a reverse of apostolic succession. Modern scholarship has been considerably more sophisticated and considerably fragmented, though, when it comes to mapping the origins of Gnosticism. There's four major options for the origins of Gnosticism, and we can evaluate them or describe them and evaluate them briefly. The first proposal is that Gnosticism arose from an acute counter between the nascent church and Hellenistic philosophy, particularly in Middle Platonism. This was Adolf von Harnack's famous thesis that Gnosticism represented the acute Hellenization of Christianity. On this view, Christians began importing Platonic categories, the transcendent God, the hierarchy of being, the corruption of matter, the descent and ascent of the soul, and then pushed them to an extreme that Orthodox Christianity resisted. The attraction of this view is its simplicity, but its weakness is that it attempts to explain too much. And that's because all of Christianity was operating within a Hellenistic intellectual framework to varying degrees, yet not all of it became Gnosticism. While all Gnosticism may be Hellenistic, not everything Hellenistic becomes Gnostic. A second proposal is that Gnosticism had pre-Christian Persian or Iranian roots. It was essentially what was termed at the time an Oriental religion of cosmic dualism that was subsequently grafted onto the Christian message. This is broadly the view associated with scholars like Rudolf Bultmann, Walter Schmittels, and others who argued for a pre-Christian Gnostic Redeemer myth that Paul and John absorbed. Now, I think there is something to that view. There is a very interesting text that Plutarch points out when he says this in Isis and Osiris. The great majority and the wisest of men hold this opinion amongst Persian philosophers, that they believe there are two gods, rivals as it were. The one, the artificer or the demiurge of the good, and the other of evil. There are those who call the better one a god and the other one a demon, as for example, Zoroaster the sage. So the kind of demiurgical dualism Plutarch certainly maps into Persian religion of the type that he was aware of. But it's probably a little bit more complex than that. You can get certain Persian influence into the early church. I mean, language like paradise and others, that's particularly interesting. But I don't think it's probably the best option available. The third proposal is that Gnosticism was internally generated within Christianity. It was a specifically Christian theological experiment. This is probably the most predominant view at the moment, and it's championed in its most sophisticated form by David Baraki. The fourth proposal, and this is the one I do find the most compelling, is that Gnosticism emerged from within Hellenistic Judaism, particularly in Alexandria, and was subsequently adopted and transformed by Jewish Christians and Gentile converts to Christianity who had absorbed its contextual resources. Now, before I set out my own view about the Jewish origins of Gnosticism, it's worth noting something. These options may not be mutually exclusive. Persian religion, Judaism, Hellenism, these things were not siloed and neatly separated from each other. Gnosticism, whatever its origins, was very likely a syncretic phenomena or very eclectic. It drew from multiple wells. What we are really asking after is what was the primary source, what provided the conceptual framework into which other elements were poured. And in my view, the answer with the most explanatory power is that Gnosticism, as we encounter it in the 2nd century, most likely emerged from Hellenistic Judaism, in particular from Egypt. And as we attempt to look at that, I think one figure who proves something of the missing link, what someone has supposed was the Cro-Magnon man of Gnosticism, was Philo of Alexandria. Now, let me be clear. I'm not arguing Philo was a Gnostic or he intended to create or anticipate Gnosticism. Philo was a fairly devout Greek-speaking Jew who believed in the goodness of creation and the law of Moses. But what I'm arguing is that Philo's synthesis of cosmology, Jewish scriptural interpretation, introduced conceptual moves, maybe not unique to him, maybe indicative of his times, and logical tensions and hermeneutical tendencies that, when pushed further and subjected to different pressures, could, and I think apparently did, evolve into the sort of ideas we find in Gnosticism. To understand Philo's significance, we must first understand the world in which he lived. Alexandria in the 1st century was one of the great intellectual centers, one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world, a city where Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Jewish theology, and various traditions were in constant creative and sometimes volatile conversation. The Jewish community of Alexandria was enormous, well-established and deeply engaged with Hellenistic culture. And Philo himself was an aristocrat, a political leader, a philosopher, one of the most learned men of the city. The great question for a Jewish intellectual in Alexandria was something like this. How do you hold together the God of Moses, the Israelite ancestral traditions, with philosophies that shape the intellectual world in which you lived? How do you read Genesis in a way that is theologically congruent with a mind formed by Plato or Platonic philosophers? Philo's attempt to answer that question is the most elaborate and sophisticated one that we possess, and I think it, on close inspection, in many ways anticipates Gnosticism. So I want to draw out now 5 ways that I think Philo anticipates Gnosticism. First, Philo draws on a hierarchy of divine beings. Philo depicts a cosmic hierarchy with the uncreated God at the summit, the Logos below him as a primary divine agent, and then an array of lesser powers and lesser forces below the Logos. The Logos is the demiurge, or a great archangel. And he says, like, the Logos is neither uncreated as God nor created as a creature. So the Logos really is an in-between being. The Logos is a divine craftsman through whom God creates the universe. Similar to Plato's demiurge, it shapes the world according to eternal forms. And Philo is very explicit that the Logos occupies a second rank. He says, he is called a God by those of us with imperfect knowledge, while the wise and perfect know the first God. Now, notice the implication there. People with the wrong knowledge mistake the Logos for God. That's going to be a very key Gnostic theme. Also, those with true knowledge, the right gnosis, understand this distinction between the Logos and the Most High God. Second, Philo's theology of divine powers. Philo observed that in the Jewish scriptures, there was something of a plurality within the God, with God. And he would often separate theos from kurios as representing not just two different aspects of God, but also like two different personalities within God, a sort of sovereign element and a more compassionate relational element. So in his treatise on the planting of Noah, he says, therefore, the appellations already mentioned reveal the powers existing in the living God. For one title is that of Lord, according to which he governs, and the other is God, according to which he is beneficent. So you've got like Lord is for the ruler and God is for the one who is merciful. And then in his work on Abraham, Philo speaks of two most ancient powers of the divine God, namely his creative and kingly power. Now, this notion of a split within the one God, a God and a Lord who are the same yet distinct in their functions, represents a conceptual move that, when radicalized, generates the Gnostic distinction between the unknowable supreme God and the active world-making demiurge. I would add as well, it has a striking resemblance with what Paul does, the Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, when he distributes the Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4 between God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I think the best analog for what Paul is doing with the Shema is Philo's distinction between the divine being as theos and the divine being as kurios. Third, and what I find very interesting, is Philo's distancing of God from the creation of humanity. This, I think, is one of the most significant anticipations of Gnosticism in Philo's thought. Philo observes that in Genesis 1:26, it speaks of God saying, "Let us make humankind in our image." And he takes the plural us with absolute seriousness. He says, why should God need companions or assistants in the act of creation? God doesn't. So Philo's answer is revealing. God needed the assistance of inferior, subordinate beings to create something as inferior as humans. So for Philo, God made the heavens directly, but the creation of human beings required the assistance of lower, inferior powers. That way, God could not be held directly responsible for the moral failures and the sinful tendencies of humanity. Now, that's something that bears rereading. God outsourced the creation of humanity to inferior beings so as not to be implicated in the failures and the fallibilities or the foibles of human beings. So the gap between God and the creation of humanity is already opening up in Philo. And in Gnosticism, that gap becomes a great chasm. So that in Gnosticism, humanity is not created by the Most High good God, but rather by an ignorant and arrogant demiurge without the one true God's knowledge or consent. Philo introduces the crack between the God of creation and the God of the heavens. The Gnostics then drive a wedge through it. Fourth, Philo's dual account of humanity in the divine image. Now, this follows as the corollary from the third point. Philo says that humans were created not in the image of the invisible God, but they were made in the image of the Logos. The Logos is the image of God, and humanity is in the image of the image. This creates a chain of mediation and representation, God, Logos, humanity, in which the original divine reality becomes progressively more distant and more marred as it goes down the chain until human beings are created. Again, the Gnostics radicalized this very point, and in the Apocryphon of John, the creation of Adam is a complex drama in which the ignorant creator named Yaltabaoth, tricked by wisdom, inadvertently instills a divine spark into the human being, a spark that properly belongs to the heavenly realm and must one day return to it. Fifth, Philo anticipates what many Gnostics would say about Sophia, or the wisdom aeon. Philo's treatment of divine wisdom, often called Sophia, anticipates the Gnostic figure of Sophia, who becomes the mother of the demiurge. Philo describes God as the father of the universe and wisdom as its mother, indeed as the mother of the Logos itself. The Logos, born of the Father and wisdom, becomes the instrument of creation. And in classical Gnostic mythology, or maybe we should call it the original Gnostic myth, Sophia, divine wisdom, fatally oversteps her proper place in the divine hierarchy, generating a lesser aeon without the knowledge of her consort. The result is the creation of Yaltabaoth, the ignorant creator. The structural parallels with Philo are unmistakable, even if Philo would have been horrified by the Gnostic conclusions drawn from his premises. So that is the world in which Philo is thinking and operating, combining the Jewish scriptures, as he knows them in Greek, with Platonic cosmology, and he's making a number of inferences that are certainly congruent and I think anticipate later Gnosticism. But I don't think Philo's conceptual moves necessarily led to the creation of Gnosticism. It wasn't simply a matter of people trying to prosecute Philo's logic or follow the argument even further. What would motivate a Jewish intellectual to make the God of Israel into the villain of the cosmic drama? And here I think we need to seriously consider the sociology and the various catastrophes that affected Judaism, both in Judea, but also in the diaspora and in places such as Alexandria. Consider what the Jewish community of Alexandria experienced in the 1st and 2nd centuries. In 38 CE, they were subjected to a catastrophic pogrom under the governor Flaccus. In 66 to 70, the Jewish revolt in Judea ended with the destruction of the temple. In 115 to 117 CE, during the reign of Trajan, the Jewish communities of Alexandria and Cyrenaica rose in revolt and were devastated, whole communities annihilated. And in 132 to 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt ended with the final exile of all Jews from Judea. These were not merely political disasters, they were theological catastrophes, which most likely led to the moving of some serious mental furniture in the way that many Jews thought about their God and his relationship to their people. If Israel's God, Yahweh, was the God of history who delivered his people from Egypt and established them in the land, then what did these cascading series of disasters mean? What options were available to a thoughtful Alexandrian Jew surveying the wreckage, the demise of the world they knew? Now, there are another number of options. One could follow Josephus and simply say that God has gone over to the side of the Romans temporarily for our sins and our impiety. One could completely abandon Judaism and fully assimilate into Greek and Roman culture. I mean, there were many Jews who did that, such as Philo's nephew, Tiberius Alexander. One could also become a follower of Jesus and follow this messianic movement and its attempt to negotiate the various challenges of the world. One could join with the survivors of Judaism after 70 AD, the emerging rabbinic movement. Now, I know the dating of the rabbinic movement is obviously contested, and between 70 and 135, there's a lot of things going on, but I think it's got its roots in the post-70 period. Or another option was to engage in a radical theological deconstruction of one's Jewish beliefs and system, reconfigure a doctrine of God, reread the Torah through an allegorical lens, and recast Yahweh not as the God of salvation, but as the God one needed to be saved from. If Plato had already given you the conceptual equipment for imagining a supreme transcendent God beyond the demiurge, beyond the Logos, beyond the creator of this world, beyond the one in whose image humanity was, then the disasters of recent history had given you reason to doubt the benevolence of a God who governed this world, so that the Gnostic move, however radical, becomes imaginable. Now, this is a historical thought experiment, not a demonstration of proof, but it gains plausibility from what we know of the geography of early Gnosticism. Basilides, one of the first documented Gnostic teachers, was active in Alexandria in the early 2nd century. Valentinus, arguably the most sophisticated of all the Gnostic theologians, came from Egypt and was educated there before going to Rome. Carl Smith, in his study No Longer Jews, has argued specifically that the religious and intellectual milieu on geographical context and chronological sequence of early Gnostic teachers and documents points to an early 2nd century rise of the Gnostic religion in the Jewish intellectual centers of North Africa. One further element in the possible Jewish origins of Gnosticism deserves attention. The transmission of these radicalized Hellenistic Jewish ideas into Christian circles developed via Jewish Christianity, specifically through Jewish Christians in Egypt who were in close contact with the Hellenized Jewish intellectual tradition. Now, I think there's several pieces of evidence here. The church father, Hegesippus, who was a Jewish convert who wrote in the 2nd century, he traced all the major heresies not back to Simon Magus, nor to Greek philosophy, but to some pre-existing Jewish sects. Irenaeus, describing the Egyptian Gnostics associated with Basilides, records that they claimed they are no longer Jews, but neither are they Christians. I mean, that's precisely what you'd expect from a group that is deconstructing their Jewish belief in Hellenistic categories, but engaging in an allegorical reading of the Hebrew Bible towards an anti-cosmic dualism way. Now, it's a striking self-description, suggesting a group that has gone beyond Jewish identity, but has not straightforwardly adopted mainstream Christian identity either. A community in a liminal space between Hellenism, Judaism, and the Christian worlds. Also, the Apocryphon of John begins with a Pharisee confronting the Apostle John about Jesus, framing the Gnostic revelation explicitly as a Jewish in-group argument. The Gospel of Thomas, which I wouldn't say is classically Gnostic, but it certainly has elements that are Gnostic adjacent or perhaps prefigure Gnostic traditions. That is a text that assigns a prominent role to James the Just, the head of the Jerusalem church. These texts breathe the air of Jewish Christianity, even as they radically transform it. It's also worth noting that what rabbinic literature tells us. After 135 CE, the rabbis developed extensive polemics against what they called the two powers in heaven heresy, the idea that there are two distinct divine powers governing the universe. Again, think of Philo's distinction between Israel's divine being as God and Israel's divine being as Lord. And Alan Segal's classic study of the two powers in heaven demonstrated that this rabbinic polemical tirade was directed partly at Christians, but also at this new emerging Gnostic group. The existence of this polemic confirms that these ideas were circulating in Jewish circles and were regarded by the rabbis as a live and dangerous threat to their own community. So then, what can we infer from all of this? Well, like I said, Gnosticism did not spring from a single source. There were a number of streams affecting it. It was incredibly eclectic. And as Bart Ehrman has observed, it appears to represent the confluence of failed Jewish apocalypticism with Middle Platonism, a meeting of disappointed Jewish hopes with the conceptual resources of Greek philosophy and cosmology. And to this, we could add the catalyst of Jewish apocalyptic and mystical traditions, the shock of successive historical catastrophes from 38 to 135 CE, and the creative ferment of a Jewish Christianity that was in close contact with all of these currents. If we were to sketch a genealogy, albeit tentatively, it would look something like this. Hellenistic philosophy provided the theological and cosmological scaffolding, especially Plato's account of the demiurge, the hierarchy of divine beings, what he says about the Logos, and how he separates God from the creation of human beings. So Hellenistic Judaism, as exemplified by Philo, applied that scaffolding to the reading of Genesis and introduced the crucial moves: distancing God from the creation of humanity, the mediation of the Logos, and the two divine powers. That created the raw conceptual material for something like Gnosticism. And it was then that historical catastrophe, particularly the devastation of Alexandrian Judaism between 115 to 117 CE, which provided the psychological and social pressure that motivated a radical theological deconstruction, turning Yahweh from deliverer into the captor of the world. Jewish Christians in Alexandria then served as the transmission point, grafting this radicalized Platonic Jewish cosmology into the Christian narrative of Jesus as the heavenly revealer who descends to liberate souls imprisoned in a world made by an inferior God. This proto-Gnostic synthesis was then taken up and developed by figures such as Basilides and Valentinus into the elaborate, sophisticated systems that Irenaeus worked so hard to refute. So in one sense, Bracky is right. Gnosticism, its fully developed second century form, is a Christian phenomena. Its Christology, its use of the Gospels, its engagement with the apostolic tradition all confirm this. But the Christian overlay was applied to a substrate that was already there, already shaped, already bearing the distinctive contours that would become Gnosticism. The Gnostics, whatever we finally make of them, were not lazy deviants or deluded fantasists. They were serious thinkers grappling with one of the hardest questions of human existence. Why is the world so broken? How can we account for evil if God is good? What is the self? Where did it come from and where is it going? They gave answers that many would reject, but we cannot reject them for asking those questions. And on the question of where they came from, I think the honest answer is, well, we don't know for certainty. But the evidence points most persistently towards the sun-drenched, intellectually restless, historically traumatized Jewish communities of Alexandria. to the world where Plato and Moses had been wrestling together for generations, and where the wrestling was about to produce something entirely new. And there, my good friends, ends my talk on the origins of Gnosticism and my attempt to plot how it emerged from the soil of Hellenistic Judaism. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to start taking some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. If you like to have some questions, my dear friends, you can ask, but I have some questions that actually this presentation made also my mind much more clearer because of the question of actually Adolf von Harnack's we are discussing also in Berlin, because he was also here, this Hellenism. That what I understand from your presentation is actually Harnack is saying Hellenism is the main, but we cannot say because there are too many sources that we need to go and we need to check, like Alexandria or like the Jewish tradition itself or the Persians, that this theory itself is a bit problematic. And through that, actually, the discussion of modalism and its resources in Greek culture can be also cannot be said, because there is also different kind of sources about it.
Yeah, that's right. Harnack was correct that there are Greek Hellenistic influences on Gnosticism. You know, in particular, Middle Platonism is a huge influence. It's theology, it's cosmology, and then eventually the same would be true of Neoplatonism. And that's where you can see how Plotinus sees Gnostics as a competitor to his own Neoplatonic project. But all of Christianity was encountering Hellenism, sometimes very acute. Like if you look at Clement of Alexandria, something like Evagrius. I mean, there are some deeply Hellenistic thinkers. So when Christianity encounters Hellenism, and it was really rooted in Hellenism the whole time, there was never a Christianity that was insulated from Hellenism, but it didn't always go in a Gnostic direction. So I don't think saying like, you know, Hellenism on steroids really answers the question. Because all of Christianity was Hellenistic to some degree or other. And in addition to that, I think there are a wide variety of other sources as well. I mean, you know, there are some elements in Gnosticism that do look similar to Persian religion, particularly, you know, the radical dualism that you get. And that becomes indigenized in Judaism, Christianity, Greek philosophy, but that's something there as well. And I tend to be more convinced of the Jewish element, because particularly the allegorical way of reading the Jewish scriptures and dealing with what I think is a Jewish problem. Why is the world so messed up that the way it is? So Harnack was correct that there's a Hellenistic influence in there, and maybe an acute Platonism might be a better way of putting it, but he was wrong to attribute the origins of Gnosticism just to Hellenism itself.
I see. My dear friends, if you have any questions, you can write, or you can just open your mic and you can also talk. And in this silent moment, I can also ask two other questions that just popped in my mind. One is that in the first concile period, specifically for Nicene and the Constantinople conciles, and these two poles between Antioch and Alexandria can be also read also as two different sources discussion, also what I understand. And the second question is that this translation of this Basileia Toteo, the kingdom of God, and also the change of Adonai to Kyrios in the time of Septuaginta, can be also read through these discussions also, that the resources of Gnosticism.
Yeah, I mean, Gnosticism continued to have an echo in subsequent centuries. It was kind of like a heresy they had to bring out every now and again and ritually denounce it. So you can get condemnations of Gnosticism for centuries. Eventually, I think it's probably replaced by Manichaeanism as as public enemy number one, certainly by the time you get to Augustine in the early 5th century. I think Antioch and Alexandria and their own schools and styles of theology maybe had different ways of dealing with Gnostic questions or proposal or heresies. Although I wouldn't press the distinction too far, because I think the idea that Alexandria and Antioch were two completely different species of Christian theologies. I think that's a dichotomy that is very overstated, and I don't think that's really utilized that much in contemporary patristic studies as I understand it. I don't know if there's any Turkish questions. Maybe you could eine Übersetzung.
Yeah, yes, there is one question from Zeynep Yazıcı. Between Marcion and Rabbinic Judaism, how did early Christianity define itself through a non-Gnostic supersessionism? And she thanks you so much.
Okay, between Marcionism and
between Marcion and Rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah, well, the Marcionism and Rabbinic Judaism are two diametrically opposed views. Marcion is kind of sort of done and dusted with the God of the Hebrew Bible, of the Septuagint, and it's the opposite of what he wants to do. Whereas Rabbinic Judaism is the attempt to rethink Judaism in light of the disasters of 70 AD and 135, and how you have no temple and you're rejected from the land. Not too dissimilar from what the Jews experienced in exile in Babylon. Yeah, I mean, Christianity was kind of aware of both. Certainly, there's extensive Christian engagement with Marcion. There seems to be limited engagement with the burgeoning rabbinic movement, but yeah, the church struggles to understand its Jewish heritage, and you can see this in a number of ways. You get someone like Justin Martyr in his dialogues with Trypho. He's affirming the inherent goodness of Israel's ancestral religion, the scriptures, the inheritance of the Jewish people, but it's kind of like he says, but you're doing it wrong. It's kind of like you've inherited a vehicle, a car from your parents, and someone's explaining why you're driving it the wrong way. You're on the wrong side of the road. You've got the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. So there was kind of like that. But then you get other views, and not as far as Marcion, but like the Epistle to Diognetus, which engages in an extensive critique of Hellenistic religion, but then it also critiques Jewish worship. And he says, well, why did the Jews worship God in the temple? I mean, God doesn't need sacrifices. It's not like he's eating the various offerings they're given to him. And the author of the Epistle to Diognetus is coming probably closer to Marcion than he is to someone like Justin, where Justin has a critique of contemporary Jewish practice. He doesn't go around saying, yeah, well, a lot of it in there was a little bit silly and unnecessary, whereas someone like the author of the Epistle to Diognetus, he's beginning to questions about the very structure, necessity, and goodness of some of the main institutions within the Jewish religion. So there was a spectrum of different ways of relating to the Jewish world, and that diversifies and they become more acute in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries.
Yes, thank you very much. I also asked that if someone wants to ask the question on Turkish, we can also translate it, but it seems there is no other questions. If you want to make a facit conclusion for like maybe 2-3 minutes, then we will end it, yeah?
Okay, sure. Well, there's a lot of scholarly debate about the origins of Gnosticism. I mean, defining Gnosticism is one thing. I don't think we should dismiss the category of Gnosticism because we do have non-Christian figures like Celsus and Plotinus talking about groups who are Gnostics, which more or less correspond to what Irenaeus and others said about them. So I think there definitely were Gnostics. This wasn't an invention of the heresiologists, nor an invention of contemporary scholarship. But where did it come from? An older view is it came from Persian religion, or maybe it simply developed natively within Christianity through an acute Hellenization. The path I've tried to map is that if we see Philo as a kind of a link between Platonic philosophy and Jewish communities, and some of the things he says about a God, the Jewish scriptures, and creation, I think we have a clear link, how you can get from Judaism to Gnostic thought and theology. Now, that's making some inferences, admittedly, but I think they're quite reasonable and fair enough. And if you then add to that both the various catastrophes that Jews faced in the 1st and 2nd century, and if you see Jewish Christians as being caught up in that and engaging with Hellenistic Jewish thinkers in places like Alexandria, I think then we have a bridge, a connection between Hellenism, Hellenistic Judaism, Christianity, or Jewish Christianity, and the origins of a Christian Gnostic tradition around figures like Basilides and Valentinus. That, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to argue for.
Yes, then thank you very much, Dr. Bird. I'm stopping the record now.